to this. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this fourth meeting of the Social Reproduction Theory Lab. And we are delighted to welcome all of you here to hear our speaker, Sirisha Naidu, who's going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes at most, followed by a question and answer series in which we recommend that you raise your hand or write a comment into chat, and I'll call on you. We can develop a robust, comradely conversation. Before we begin, however, I'm going to turn it over briefly to Sue Ferguson regarding the book series. Just a little, I think, a little plug, if you would.
Sure. Thanks. I wasn't really prepared to do that, but I'm very happy.
Sorry.
But so the Tithi Bhattacharya and myself are co-editors of the Pluto book series on social reproduction called Mapping Social Reproduction Theory. Aaron has a wonderful book in that's part of that as well. I do want to plug, though, we've got a couple new books that are just out. One is called Going into Labor by Anna Fielder, which is an amazing distillation of birth workers' labor, both people who give birth and people who attend births. And it's an amazingly astute analysis. And Anna herself was a midwife, and so draws from that as well as her very remarkable kind of analytic capacities. So, and then we also have I'm Alan Sears's new book, which I'm blanking. It's on the title. I'm sorry. Labor and hang on. I'm sorry. I'll put it in the chat in a moment. But and it's about sexuality and social reproduction and desire and how the capitalism kind of controls and directs in many ways our channels, our desires in particular ways, and what that means for the left as we try to build a left. So it's a really fascinating book. We've got an upcoming book coming out in the fall on Palestine and social reproduction. That's a edited collection that I think I saw Rachel Rosen in the group. She's one of the contributors to that. It's a wonderful piece on childhood and social reproduction, along with many other very strong pieces. So I will leave it at that and turn it back over, and I'll put some information in the chat in a second about that.
Thank you so much, Sue. It is my pleasure to hand it over to Sirisha Naidu, who's an associate professor of economics and affiliate faculty in the Department of Race, Ethnic, and Gender Studies at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Her research focuses on feminist political economy and analyses of agrarian change and ecological shifts, environmental justice, and the interwoven tapestry of productive and reproductive labor in the global South, and informal and precarious work in the global economy. She has published in journals like the Journal of Agrarian Change, Ecological Economics, World Development, Agrarian South, and the Review of Radical Political Economy, as well as many others. She's co-editing a book titled Radical Political Economy of the Environment. She's also producer and co-host of the monthly radio show and podcast Economics for the People on 90.1 KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio. It's my pleasure, and please join me in welcoming Sirisha Naidu.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Sue, and thanks to everyone who's here. We were talking about what an interesting and perhaps an overwhelming time it is, and I suppose I should start the presentation by sharing the presentation, and so let me do that. So I want to actually talk about crises and social reproduction crises. And I've titled it Every Day is a Struggle because, I'm going to argue that it's an ongoing crisis for many people in the global South. And there's been, particularly since the pandemic, but also since the 2008 economic crisis, a lot of discussion, writings about the crisis or crises Many people have talked about it as multiple crises, either leading to an organic crisis or a larger organic crisis. They've talked about it as nested crises. Adam Tooze has talked about it as a polycrisis. And then, of course, Nancy Fraser, who many of us have used in our work, also talks about the crisis of social reproduction as a crisis for capitalism, and one that has been ongoing and is endemic to capitalism itself. I want to argue that capitalist crises translate to crises of social reproduction for working classes, but the crisis of social reproduction does not necessarily translate to a crisis for capitalism. And I want to argue this by also drawing on the writings and understanding of relative surplus population. And so that's what I'm going to draw on. So really the questions being, what is the crisis of social reproduction? And then what are the ramifications of a capitalist crisis for the working classes? And how can we, and maybe collectively in part of the discussion, we could discuss what are the political sort of interventions that are possible and how to navigate them. And even if we're not able to discuss them in its entirety today, what kinds of thoughts can we take back to the places that we live in and organize in, and in our efforts to build global solidarity. So I want to offer, this my entry point into this work on social reproduction comes from feminist agrarian studies and my work on ecological issues. And what we know from that literature, particularly the agrarian studies literature, is that many countries in the global south did not experience and are not experiencing the agrarian transition that scholars theorized about economies and that were based on the experiences in Euro-America. And in 2016, Lynn Osome and I published a paper which was titled Social Reproduction and the Agrarian Question of Women's Labor, in which we challenged the argument that livelihood scholars were making at that time, that multiple livelihoods constituted a pathway out of poverty. And we argued that, that first, that was not true, and that, a lot of the sort of survival tactics relied on what people normally refer to as a pathway out of, or refer to as reproductive labor. And then from my own earlier, field work in the forested areas of the Himalayan regions in India, which is early in my academic career, I also knew that reproductive labor was not merely restricted to women, and that the work that feminists were producing in India and other parts of the global south were talking about all the different ways in which women were engaged in various kinds of economic activities, both waged and unwaged. So what I want to talk about in terms of social reproduction, I want to draw in this distinction that Alessandra Mezzadri makes in terms of the social reproduction approaches, where we have the early social reproduction approaches drawing from Maria Dalla Costa, Selma James, Maria Mies, Fortunati, Federici, et cetera, And then we have social reproduction theory, which is Titi Bhattacharya, Sue Ferguson, Nancy Fraser, and so on. And then I sort of locate my work drawing from the early social reproduction approaches, but really drawing from sort of experiences and writing about the global south, and talking about or challenging the distinction between productive and unproductive spheres, and also sort of how capital does, in fact, extend control over both the means of production and reproduction. And there's been sort of some very interesting work that has emerged from the global south. But what I want to talk about, or what I want to start off with first, is to talk about sort of the circuits of social reproduction. And this is something that Titi Bhattacharya had offered in her work in 2017. But unlike Titi's work, where which starts with money and then ends with money, I actually don't have money in my circuit of social reproduction. And so a little bunch of equations. I promise there aren't too many, and they're not really very complex equations. And I hope those of you who don't like seeing all these alphabets and Greek letters will bear with just 2 slides. So in terms of the circuit of social reproduction, if you can direct your attention to the first line, which talks about the articles of consumption, which are which through a process of production produce labor power, which then allows the worker, the waged worker, to accumulate a wage fund and then purchase articles of consumption. And this would be true if, in fact, we only have wage worker and we only have social reproduction being fulfilled by wage work. But what we do find in many economies of the global south, and perhaps a lot of people and groups of people, even in the global north, is that the articles of consumption actually are not entirely satisfied by the wage fund. And so the second line, we have articles of consumption that are required or necessary consumption that ends up in this process of social reproduction, but only allows the wage worker to produce commodities and not, and I'm sorry, I found an error, and this should say commodities, and not engage in necessary consumption. And so what I present is that the articles of consumption or necessary consumption are not just satisfied by commodities, but all of the work that happens outside of wage work. This could be domestic production, this could be housework, this could be through consumption that is afforded by nature and so on. And underlying all of this consumption is, of course, labor processes. And these labor processes, the total labor time that is expended in work is not just it's not just in terms of wage labor, but also in terms of all of the non-wage labor that occurs. And then finally, the second equation on this slide talks about how we have sort of this alpha, which really is some kind of, parameter that allows for the extension and sort of the extension of the workday. So, don't want to spend too much time on this. And here's perhaps a graphical representation of this. And so we have necessary consumption as being sort of central to the labors of social reproduction. And this necessary consumption represents needs, it represents wants, it represents the need for community, the need for family, cultural needs, the need to be in nature, some of which, and some of these needs, of course, are not satisfied for many people. But in any case, the blue circuit, which I have termed as circuit 1, is that of wage labor, the traditional site of class struggle between capitalist workers and employers. But this wage labor may not satisfy or fully satisfy socially determined levels of consumption needed for social reproduction. The thing, of course, is that this wage labor itself is not homogeneous. It's often subject to occupational segregation or pay gaps due to caste, ethnicity, gender, and race. And these may refer to, these may erect what some have referred to as glass walls in the South Asian context that prevent both horizontal and vertical mobility. Now, caste, race, gender, etc., in this conceptualization is not external to capitalism, value production, or exploitation. So in the Indian context, Mary John discusses how paid manual labor provided by Dalit people, particularly Dalit women, is subject to what she refers to as the stigma of labor, where their work is socially devalued, even as it produces value and grants a greater degree of surplus extraction. So unlike Nancy Fraser's hidden abode of capitalism, which is external to value production and exploitation, and similar to discussions of racial capitalism, caste and gender then are integral to value production and capitalist exploitation and not external. Now, the Second Circuit, which is really emerges from non-wage labor, uses nature and state, or is kind of like the amount, it can be amount of non-wage labor that produces goods and services is shaped by the institutions of state, but also shaped by access to nature, but it ends up producing commodities. So this represents a gamut of labor processes such as petty commodity production, home-based work, various forms of self-employment, and forms of disguised wage labor that contribute to commodity production. Now, in the Indian context, Kalyan Sanyal characterizes the space as the space of the excluded, as a separate space of a needs economy that sustains the working classes. But in my conceptualization, where there is some overlap between Sanyal's need economy, it's not conceptualized as being separate from the accumulation economy. It coexists with wage labor and in global capitalist circuits, and it's embedded in a complex network of value generation and subject to exploitation at different points in the production process, even as it's subject to differing levels of control by capital. And this sort of draws on Maria Mies's work, where she argues, how lace makers in Narsapur in India are termed as housewives, but really are producing value and are embedded in global capital accumulation. And of course, Alessandra Mazzadri has also done a fair amount of work on this. So, but this is not just a case for India or for economies in the global south. As we experience this decline of state support for socialized provisioning, even in the global north, we observe working classes who are forced to take on multiple jobs across fragmented spaces. And this, of course, is in addition to those groups of racialized people in the global north who are already experiencing such economic precarity. And then the Third Circuit describes a labor process where uncommodified labor or non-wage labor produces uncommodified goods and services that satisfy necessary consumption. This may be in the form of subsistence farming, but it could also include all forms of other forms of subsistence production, which is taking care of livestock and poultry, walking miles to get water and firewood, childcare, elder care. And much of this work is often laborious and literally backbreaking and historically performed by women in many cultures. Now, this energy expended in this circuit tends to be heavily gendered, of course, but also racialized and caste-based, and they contribute to the contextual expression of the social relations of production. So while the First and Second Circuits allow households to consume commodities purchased in the market, that doesn't necessarily satisfy necessary consumption, and that necessary consumption is then bridged by the Circuit 3. And I sort of almost regret the use of the word bridge because it's somehow suggests that it steps in when not possible. But really, we know that even in places where wage labor dominates, that non-wage labor, care labor of all kinds, and domestic labor of all kinds does come in and have to play a role in terms of social reproduction. So what I present in this in this diagram is a stylized representations of the labors of social reproduction. So this is the work energy required to produce or reproduce working people. And by working people, I don't just mean wage workers. And so these circuits are co-constituted through the logic of capitalism and the social relations of production, but they're not entirely defined by the capitalist logic. So the division between production and reproduction is relevant to capital and how we perceive the functioning of capitalism. But from the perspective of working people, for a long time, people have said this is true of working people in the global South, but perhaps increasingly, we also need to think about working people in the global North. This distinction between production and reproduction may be less clear. So participation in these multiple labor processes serves the purpose of social reproduction within the constraints imposed by the capitalist economy. And in a recently published paper, Smriti Rao and I, we look at time use, the National Indian Time Use Survey, to argue how different labor processes constitute traditional sort of occupational categories, so that even among wage workers, whether they are within the informal and the formal economies, end up engaging in a whole host of labor processes, including that of subsistence production. And so to really think about all the different ways in which working people in the global South and perhaps working people across different economies engage in various aspects of these circuits. And this might be true of different people in a particular household engaging or being part of different circuits, or even the same person participating in different aspects of what I describe as the labors of social reproduction. So the actual allocation of time and effort in these labor processes may vary across what Laura Borer has referred to as quote unquote interwoven oppressions of caste, race, and gender. But differences may also emerge due to spatial and temporal conditions and result in different lived realities. So Lynn Asome and I, for instance, we compared women's labor force participation in South Africa, or an increase in women's labor force participation in South Africa, and a decline in women's labor force participation in India. And what we argue is that in both cases, women are responding to capitalism's differing yet immiserating trajectories. And so it's a response to specific or historical conditions that exist in South Africa and India. Now, the sum total of these labors is the total workday, the labors of social reproduction. And when working people engage in a cornucopia of these labor processes, it represents a lengthening and an intensification of the total workday. And to some degree, again, we see this as much as in the US as we do in other parts of the world, the celebration of the side hustle, right? The celebration of being busy in some ways is an indication of that. So the lengthening of the workday could occur in the workplace by the capitalist or the manager working for the capitalist, but the workday could also be lengthened due to total work necessary in order to ensure social reproduction. So if this alpha that I mentioned crosses a threshold, that's what represents the kind of lengthening of the workday, then it may be associated with physiological and psychological costs that affect workers or working people, whether they are wage workers or not. So in talking about exploitation, often Marxists and others have represented wage labor as being subject to exploitation. But Marxist historian Jairus Banerjee argued in 1977 that wage labor only represents one of many forms of exploitation in capitalism, and that value cannot merely be linked to wages, just as exploitation should not be linked to wage labor. And Isa Shivji, based on Walter Rodney's work and his own writings from 1980s on Tanzania, discusses the need for a paradigmatic shift in understanding the peasant experience of exploitation and not just oppression under capitalism. So this exploitation is related to reducing, and I want to come to this, is also related to reducing necessary consumption, and I'm going to come to this in just a bit. So how do we understand the crisis of social reproduction? And I want to provide an example that I used in a 2021 paper in which I interrogate the role of the state and markets in their failure to provide the conditions of reproduction during the pandemic. So on April 18th, 2020, under a very severe lockdown in India, a 12-year-old Jamlo Makdam from Chhattisgarh, which is a state in India, she worked in the chili fields of a village in a southern state, and she died after fleeing the stringent and sudden national lockdown. And she died because she walked 150 kilometers in 3 days before succumbing to exhaustion and dehydration less than 50 kilometers from her home. And I still sort of get a little kind of emotional thinking about that. And Jamlu's story is ostensibly one of incompetency of the the federal and the state governments that did not plan for safe and affordable transportation of the more than 50 million low-wage migrant workers engaged in informal work who were desperate to return home during the pandemic because work has stopped, and which meant that they had no wages, and which meant that they couldn't pay rent and so on. And it does represent this sort of crisis of social reproduction, right? And Jamlo's story is just one of many and countless others, in India, but also in other places, Yemen, Sudan, Palestine, who are facing varying levels of economic, political, and social violence. But buried in that is another story of a crisis that Indians, aided by the ideological institutions of Indian capitalism, have normalized. And that is one which compels a 12-year-old to work unaccompanied as a farm worker about 200 kilometers away from her home. Now, the media did not adequately report on the material conditions of Jamlo Makdam's life and her house or her circumstances, but we can infer some things based on the very meager information that we have. And we can infer that there's insufficient employment in the state that she belongs to, low wages because she is a girl, she's a child, and that she also belonged to the tribal or the Adivasi community, one of the most marginalized communities in a state, the state of Chhattisgarh, where corporate powers salivate at the vast wealth of minerals buried within the lands that the Adivasis or the tribals live. And so everyday life is pocked with high levels of police violence, as well as other forms of economic, political, legal, and social violence. So even if she had not made the headlines, had she lived, she is just one instance of the everyday crisis of social reproduction. So this Jamlo story, this everyday crisis of social reproduction, is the story of the vast majority of working people in India who survive, who are already self-reliant on gendered household labor that the capitalist economy and the state take for granted. And it also represents the exhaustion of an immiserated workforce. So it's just, as I mentioned, an extraordinary instance of the everyday struggles of the working classes in India, and perhaps the working classes in many other economies in the global south. By the way, the graphic that I have posted is the cover of an illustrated book that someone produced after she passed away, or after she, I would say, was killed by the violence that was perpetrated during the pandemic, but the everyday violence that she was victim of. And so this really tells the story of, Jamlo Makdam. So how do we think about, how do we think about this population that in some ways is surplus to capitalism, right? The struggles of the relative surplus population. This population that Marx characterized as floating, latent, and stagnant is also engaged in the labors of social reproduction. Just because it does not participate in wage labor, it doesn't mean that it is not somehow incorporated into the accumulation that capitalism engages on an everyday basis, whether that is through cobbling together some livelihood to purchase commodities, whether it is through relations of debt, whether it is, all sorts of other ways in which it gets incorporated. So Marx also talks about the lowest stratum of the relative surplus population that experiences pauperism. So it's no longer entirely needed by capital. They're part of that, the permanent surplus population, and different from the reserve army of labor that at least still serves as still serves a disciplining function. So this sum of humanity, including the relative surplus population, the paupers, but as well as those who are contributing labor power, the working classes, and entirely disposable from the perspective of capital. So Melissa Wright argues in her book, Disposable Women and Other Myths of Global Capitalism, that women workers are framed as disposable, and that capital accumulation benefits from the wasting away of these workers' bodies. So when and this is why when we talk about necessary consumption, I wanted to represent it not just as what many economists refer to as needs and wants, but also all of the other needs that we require in order to kind of function as humans, and yet many of us, particularly those within the lowest stratum of the working classes, do not have access to. So when even the combined efforts of the labors of social reproduction are insufficient to meet necessary consumption, working people experience conditions of immiseration or an acute crisis of social reproduction. So it may be due to a conjunctural moment like the pandemic, but often it is uneventful. So as Tanya Murray Lee writes in a 2010 paper, and I quote, "Letting die is not an apocalypse. It is not a media event. It is a stealthy violence that consigns large numbers of people to lead short and limited lives." So to reiterate, this crisis of social reproduction for the humanity of the working classes, the disposable portion of humanity from the perspective of capital, does not necessarily constitute a crisis for capitalism. Now, capitalism is indeed experiencing a crisis, but not because workers and working people are experiencing a crisis of social reproduction. Again, to quote Tanya Murray Lee, put crudely, if some portion of the relative surplus population died tomorrow, the rate of profit would remain the same and the GDP in the affected countries would increase, end quote. Now, I don't know if it would increase or not, but we are definitely experiencing in the US and around the world, including for people who have been under genocidal attacks. Now, in any case, we cannot reduce capitalism merely to its economic components. And so the same way as we speak of neoliberalism as a cultural project that leans heavily on economic dimensions, we need to think of capitalism as a whole in a similar manner as well. So Margaret Thatcher, for instance, reportedly claimed that her greatest achievement was the creation of new labor. So the neoliberal solution became so hegemonic that even its opponents on the left accepted its terms. So what are the ramifications of a capitalist crisis? And rather than get into sort of a lengthy discussion on it, because we're running out of time, what I want to mention is that a capitalist crisis definitely poses some challenges to the working classes because it impacts the ability to obtain wages, the ability to be employed by capital. But for a vast majority of the population, they are already engaging in the production of goods and services. So while the working classes do experience a crisis, when capitalism experiences a crisis, as we observed during the pandemic, as well as during the Great Recession, it also represents moments of, or spaces for challenging the capitalist hegemony. And this is not just, and the challenge does not necessarily have to be just restricted to the capitalist workplace, that if we actually focus our attentions on the labors of social reproduction, all the different ways in which people are, in all the different labor processes that people engage in, and the mechanisms by which these labor processes articulate to capitalism, we could potentially find multiple sites of class struggle, and it allows us to understand at least the economic processes that working classes are engaged in and are embroiled in, and to think about organizing in ways that could be effective in challenging and engaging in a struggle against this violence, the everyday crisis that working people suffer from. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Naidu. So we have a significant amount of time for question and answer, and everyone should feel free to raise their hand. I'll turn on perhaps gallery view. And if you don't raise your hand, you also feel free to write your question or comment on the talk in the chat, and I'll be happy to read it aloud. And please don't be shy. This was a rich and conceptually precise and politically opening, especially at the end there. Wonderful talk. Well, if I don't see a hand, I'll kick it off. So I really appreciated slide 9 there with its 3 circuits of the different kinds of labor that go into the consumption appropriate to social reproduction as a whole. And I'm really compelled by the idea that we can't make a super sharp distinction between production and social reproduction. And I liked the ending of the talk too, where in the midst of capitalist crisis, you suggested that I think workers in Circuit 2 or Circuit 3 could understand themselves as political agents. We could see them as political agents responding to capitalist crisis, maybe hopefully in an anti-capitalist way. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. What kinds of agency, maybe forms of organization would be appropriate to workers in Circuit 2 or 3 as properly anti-capitalist political agents? And I know there's not like a clear distinction, like everybody's doing 1, 2, and 3 at different points of the ladder. So not to make too sharp a distinction, but if you could maybe a little bit more on the political content at the close there.
So one of the and I will kind of draw from my understanding of the Indian economy and the struggles in India. As many of you know, that India transitioned into sort of neoliberalism in the 80s, but more formally in the 1990s. And since that time, we have seen this agrarian economy, India used to be largely agrarian, both in terms of its employment, but also in terms of the contribution of agriculture to GDP. So what we've seen, and when I said failed agrarian transition, is that the contribution of agriculture to GDP declined substantially, but agriculture still employed for a very long time the majority of the population. And it's still, the percentage is close to 50%, though it has gone down since, in these decades. It still employs most of the women's labor force, right? So about 90% of women's labor force is employed in agriculture in various ways. Now, over the years, this incorporation of the workforce into the non-agricultural economy as waged workers, whether in the formal or the informal economies, has been, disciplined through various labor laws. Right. So in the last decade or so, there have been some quite horrifying labor laws that have been, or disappointing and horrifying in some ways. And we have never seen the kind of uprising against those laws as we do whenever the state wants to touch land and change land acquisition laws. Because as much as workers are participating in the wage economy, it still does not provide enough for any form of respectable, decent living. And so it's unclear whether wage work is subsidizing non-wage work or whether non-wage work is subsidizing wage work. Because there are, by some accounts, about 100 million circular or migrants who engage in a circular economy. In other words, they move to the city, urban spaces, and then they move out. And so, sometimes it's seasonal, sometimes, so they're part of that floating population. And they still rely on the village economy, which is largely or draws from, peasant. And I'm not arguing that that's a better form of mode of production or anything, but definitely all different, circuits 2 and 3 they still rely on that heavily. And the most recent example, or the stark example of this, was during the pandemic when, the state and the market did not provide for the workers. And so everyone went back to their village. And what we found was an increase in women's employment in agriculture during this period. So in 2022, there was a year-long farmer strike, if anyone paid attention. And granted, it was a strike that drew from, a population from the northern states, but you don't see that kind of mobilization, right? And I think to some degree, that's because land continues. And the other mobilization that happened was in 2006, when forest dwellers mobilized to get access to historic land rights that they were dispossessed of in late 1800s under the British. And one of the amazing aspects of that struggle was that they not only got back individual rights, but they also fought for community land rights. Now, this is under attack now under the current administration. But to answer your question, the things that have mobilized people the most are around land, whether that's private land or common land. And the state that Jamlu Magdam belongs to, which is Chhattisgarh, which is central India, the populations, the indigenous population or the Adivasis there have been struggling under various administrations and refusing to give up their land, their rich, mineral-rich land, even though they are the most economically, socially, and politically marginalized populations of India.
Thank you so much. We have 2 further questions. questions or comments, I'll read aloud the comment in the chat and then ask Anna Maria Macaire-Linares to unmute. So in the chat, we have from Savandi Aberatna. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The question, what is your take on time poverty, necessary consumption, and the role of debt financing in bridging the gap? In such a case, is the crisis of social reproduction engineered by design from the financialized neoliberal capitalism? And then let's get perhaps Anna Marie's question, and then I'll let you respond to both if that's okay. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sirisha, for the wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask, probably you know where I come from, about the role of the state. So I think that social reproduction approaches still needs to do a lot of work on dealing and grappling with theorization, conceptualizations of what the role of the state in social reproduction processes is. And it looks that, so most of it have been in a way conceptualized or theorized with this idea of the state as a mediator. So at least that's how mostly, at least the Canadian School of Social Reproduction has done. And so you had that in their slide, so that's why I kind of come up with the question. Also, you had a comment now on the role of the state in the land, related to the land law. So yeah, so my question is about that exactly, right? So what explicitly that mediation role implies, and what might we missing from kind of emphasizing in that mediation role instead of maybe thinking in different ways or in kind of more complex ways of thinking about that, where we should be focusing on the must be or what the role of the state should be instead of what actually the state does, and kind of a general reflection toward that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Savandi, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and thank you, Anna Marie. So to answer the question on time poverty, necessary consumption, and role of debt financing, I haven't written explicitly on time poverty, but that's really what I'm trying to get with this idea that of lengthening the workday, right? Which is that particularly for those people, women and others engaged in social reproduction, how does the total workday lengthen because of all the labor processes that they're engaged in, right? Whether that is wage labor, whether that's unwaged labor, whether that's productive work, reproductive work, in the household, outside the household, it doesn't matter, right? Because if you're thinking about the household and if you're thinking about the survival and maybe the flourishing of the household, you're going to do anything to make that happen, right? And traditionally, we know that women have taken on that role, but, let's, to make sure that we're incorporating all different sort of genders and so on, right? So that's the take on time poverty. The thing that I didn't mention and I forgot to mention about necessary consumption is that that capitalism also plays a role in our understanding of what is necessary consumption, right? Because we know that necessary consumption is socially determined, and we, as much as the labor movement has played an extremely important role in shaping our understanding of wages, of what we can demand. In the US context, the family wage was something that the labor movement took on and so on. It's not like capital doesn't play a role in shaping our understanding of what necessary consumption should be. So if we talk about the current moment where suddenly increasing prices or inflation is a cost that we must bear in order to fulfill a larger kind of objective, that is what the working people are being told to bear, right? Which means that reduce your necessary consumption because there is a larger project that needs to be fulfilled. And, if the price of eggs increases and you cannot consume eggs, or you cannot consume meat and all of that, and this is something that has happened in the past, right? So E.P. Thompson talks about this in the making of the English or the dietary class war, which convinced 18th century English working classes to shift consumption from wheat to potatoes. And we know in the context of India too that there are all of these ideologies, right? So what I'm kind of the point that I'm trying to make is that we often fall into this trap of thinking about it just from an economic perspective, but of course, economic policies are also very intimately tied to ideological projects, right? So we really need to think about what the ideological project is. So even if it is not socially engineered in an explicit way, this is what capitalism wants. It wants the working people in the US to take a step back, reduce its consumption so that it can realign whatever it needs to realign, which is not just the project of surplus accumulation, but also the ideological project of possibly an inter-imperialist war or struggle. And so we really need to think about how all of this kind of plays, and not plays as external to capitalism, but is an integral. And this is what I meant by, neoliberalism is a cultural project, and so is capitalism, right? Neoliberalism being one sort of phase of capitalism. And so it is a cultural project, and we need to treat it as such. And definitely debt financing has played a very important role, particularly in the US and increasingly in India as well, to ensure that the working classes don't revolt against declining consumption. But of course, it has a cost, and that cost is ultimately borne by the working classes themselves. Anna Marie, to answer your question of the role of the state, so I thank you for that, because it's such an interesting question. And so in 2021, I wrote a paper which talks a little bit about that role of the state, right? And the state, again, as part of, as an institution, some will argue it's an institution of capitalism, or it's an institution which definitely, is a site of class struggle itself, right? But in India, when we think of the state, what I argue in that paper, the state plays as a mediator 3 roles, right? One is it intervenes in the labor market, or it plays 3 roles for, our thinking of the state as it's in its function in the economy, right? It plays a role in intervening in the labor market. It plays a role in terms of social protections, which is the welfare state in Europe and North America, but really in places like India and many other countries in the global south, the state has not played that kind of role, right? At most, it has afforded some kind of, slipshod kind of policies of social protection, but it's not been comprehensive. The third role that it plays is that of mediating access to the means of reproduction. And what I mean by that is that as much as we talk of proletariat, like the process of proletarianization as the process of dispossession and not having ways to reproduce, we still do, right? I mean, that little patch of land, for instance, right? And at different times and, depending on, like in different contexts, the state has ensured that working classes have that little patch of land to produce, so that in order to ensure super exploitation, right? And in some cases, it has ensured that that land is dispossessed because it has way more profitable uses than ensuring reduction in wages. So to talk about the complex ways, we can definitely think about how, if we want to take, use Polanyi, right, the double movement, people kind of pushing back and struggling to influence the state, particularly if we're talking about democracy. So the example that I gave of the historic forest rights in India, and again we can talk about this in other contexts as well, is one example where the state played this role of, so basically that became a law. It became an act where everyone who is a forest dweller and could prove it before, had documents, at least since 1980, were given that land, that forested land, which was classified until then as state land. But even as it passed that act, because of tremendous pressure from social movements, it also has constantly served to undermine it. Right? And so the state can play this kind of dual role of, passing something that seems worker friendly or friendly to the working people, and yet constantly undermine it because it also serves this other role of ensuring conditions for profitability. And so that's my answer to you in terms of the state.
I think we might have time for another round, and I see a comment in the chat, and then I'll call on my co-conspirator, Sue. Raisa Ruiz writes, Professor Naidu, thank you very much for your talk. Can you talk a bit more about how do you see genocide as a process in the global South? I wonder what's the utility of the concept of surplus population to think about genocide in global South in a social reproductive perspective, regarding the general conditions of life and labor of the working class in general. For example, historically, we have more informal labor than formal, and as you said before, wage labor is not even predominant in many settings. And then Sue, and I'll give you a chance to respond to both.
Those are great questions. I'm really enjoying this conversation. So thanks so much for sparking it, Sirisha. So I'll just a couple things that I just wanted to get a little more clarity around. One of the things around the distinction between production and reproduction that's been important for me for trying to figure out, or doing unproductive work, that is work that does not directly produce value for capital, is that is important politically in terms of a demand that we want to expand that area. We want to make that, because that is where, in my, where I think people can find elements of freedom within this capitalist network that we are all enmeshed in. And I don't have any disagreement with that at all about, I think capitalism is a total, holistic system that captures our productive and unproductive labor. It's just, I guess, technicalities about, at some level, about how much of it is being directly reproducing capitalist value and how much isn't, or whatever, where I might have some debate with you. I don't know. But anyway, so I just wondered if you have, so when I look at your circuit 2 and 3, I'm thinking, okay, yes, I totally see that. Is there any value in your mind, I guess, in thinking through the distinctions between the circuit 2 and circuit 3, like in terms of how we fight back, I guess, against capital? So that is my question. And just a note on that too, is because I think part of the problem is that we've been stuck on, maybe, and I've been guilty of this myself, using wages as kind of a catch-all term for when what we really mean is monetized income, the people who are producing something that will ultimately give them some money. And so I'm also thinking there's a question of where money fits into all this circuit too, and how important it is for us to think that through a little bit more from a social reproductive perspective. But so that was one question. I'm sorry if these are too complicated, and just leave one aside if it's too, because the second one is just around your notion of crisis. And I really appreciate you saying there is, a crisis in social reproduction is not a crisis for capitalism. In fact, it's good for capitalism. And I just wondered if you could, though, talk a little bit more about when you think we should use that term, specifically, or because if it's at some level, capitalism usual, produces crisis in social reproduction, and but it's also dependent on our social reproduction. So it's a problem. I like Ruth Wilson Gilmore's understanding of organized abandonment, and I wonder, and as a way of thinking about how the state helps to produce a crisis in social reproduction too. And anyway, these are more loose terms for me to throw around at you and see whether they inspire any brilliance on your part, which I'm always happy to hear.
Oh my, such interesting questions. I wish we were doing this in person, right? Because then, it just feels like, anyway, but I don't know if I will do full justice to both of them, just in terms of time, but also because these are kind of larger questions and deeper questions, that some of which I have been trying to think through and not entirely found a satisfactory answer for myself, and some of which I'm sort of there, but not quite there. So the first question on genocide, right? And the reason I brought up Jamlo Makdum's example is because a genocide seems extraordinary, right? Because it's very targeted, it's very specific, but there are vast portions of the population that are dying anyway. Right? I mean, if you think of, and we don't even have to go to the global south, we can think about the US. We can think about the South Side Chicago, where the life expectancy for Black men is way lower than life expectancy for white men, right? And all the ways in which capitalism and capitalist institutions have been corralled in order to discipline this surplus population, whether it is through forms of, incarceration, whether it is through, or even if we think about immigration currently, right? This kind of panic over immigration and ways in which to discipline this immigrant labor, whether, they're, all forms of immigrant labor, right? Even though there is a shortage of workers in the US, by the way. Isn't that a funny contradiction, right? The US actually has a shortage of workers, and it has a shortage of workers even before the current administration. And it responds to it by rounding up immigrants, right? So in some ways, I think that I think it definitely changes, right? So this kind of genocide of people whose lands are important, right, has happened in the US, has happened in the Middle East, or is happening in the Middle East, is happening in the global South as well. And, so it's not the people who are important, but their land is. And something for us to, and for us to think about crisis both in that context, but also in the context of the everyday violence, right? Because not all of that, what we term as crisis, kind of this wiping away of populations, happens as an extraordinary event. It's happening every day, right? It's happening, as we talk about, the UN keeps talking about, places with the worst famine ever and the worst crisis ever. And, we just go about our lives, right? It's not a crisis for us because it's not a crisis in the global North, and it's not a crisis for capitalism. And so that leads me to your question, Sue, about how do we talk about crisis, right? So one objective that I have with respect to talking about social reproduction over the various papers that I've written is to not talk about social reproduction from the context of capitalism and what it does to capitalism, but to decenter capitalism and say what happens to workers who are living under capitalism, right? And so that changes how we think about social crisis, right? So yes, every capitalist crisis, the reason being is that we talk of a crisis only when there is a capitalist crisis. And I want to see if we can somehow intervene and change that to talk about a crisis every time the working classes or working people in general face a crisis, right? So then we begin to not normalize all of this violence, but we also begin to question what is happening with us, but also question what's happening globally. So that's one kind of response. Oh, wait, I just lost my page. And the other aspect of this is so how do we think of this crisis? Again, like I mentioned, is not just in terms of this, oh, we have a pandemic and then we think of a crisis. Yes, the pandemic was a crisis for us, right? There were hordes of people, thousands of people dying across the world, right? There were countries and cities that couldn't handle the number of bodies. There were no places to bury people. There were no places to cremate people in the case of India. And it still didn't produce the change, right? So if we think about crisis as sort of a call to action, right? Or, potentially, it didn't change anything because in some ways the conversation was focused on the capitalist crisis. So as soon as the capitalist crisis was resolved, everyone, I don't mean everyone, but you know what I mean, right? But like everyone went back to their merry ways. Right, so that's one aspect of it, and then in terms of the distinctions between circuits 2 and 3, and how do we think about production and reproduction? One is that circuit 2 produces money because it produces commodities, but it is different from wage labor. So we definitely want to pay attention to that, right? Because circuit 1 and circuit 2 are not the same, even though they're producing money. So I think perhaps that is a better way to think of it. I have written, a book chapter which will be published this year, talking about all of those distinctions, right? The distinction between or trying to trouble the distinction between production, reproduction, waged, unwaged, because we know from Marxist literature that wage labor is also unwaged labor, right? Like this, and also the distinction between place, right? Talking about domestic versus not, right? How do we, but I think perhaps monetized versus non-monetized, but then also recognizing that wage labor is different from the labor that still produces money, whether that is through informal economies or that's home-based labor, which actually does not get counted as, those people are not counted as workers, right? But then the other thing is also like how, again, can we make an intervention in terms of the political demands of not just being incorporated into the capitalist wage economy or the capitalist economy or providing for capitalism, because we see now, since the 1980s, when people in the global South, or particularly in Latin America, were writing about informal economies, and people thought of it as a transition towards formal economies, now policymakers have abandoned that distinction, right? And are now celebrating informal economies, right? So what is gig work in the US and other parts of the world, but informal or forms of informal economy, right? And so now that's being celebrated as something, right? So how do we even trouble that, right? Because what we really, in the end, what we really care about is, do people have, one, can we as part of the global working classes, can we control what we understand as as socially determined consumption, necessary consumption, and then can we actually ensure that our economies satisfy that, right? And so that might require some forms of non-monetized work, and we want that to happen. We know in our own lives that many of us do crave, when we're, in the context of Euro-America, when people are talking about work-life balance, that's really what they're asking for, is some time for social reproduction of ourselves, right? And some time to spend with our families and play music and go out for a walk in nature, etc. So, so I think I see this as a way to perhaps shift that conversation on what our political demands can be. And the political demand could be that whether it's wage labor or not, what we want is a decent life, right?
That feels like a wonderful, wonderful place to stop with a fantastic fantastic talk, theoretically rich, conceptually precise, and politically motivating. Thank you so much, Professor Sirisha Naidu, and for our wonderful question and answer session after the talk. Please join us next month for the fifth session of our Social Reproduction Theory Lab, and I look forward to seeing all of you then. Once again, thank you, Professor Naidu.
Thank you for this invitation. I've enjoyed listening to the other talks as well, and looking forward to the next one. Thanks.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.